Just a trigger warning here that the following episode of my podcast does contain discussion about sexual violence. There are no graphic details regarding this. However, if you find this topic upsetting, please stop the podcast and have a break. And if you feel up to it, you can come back to the podcast at a later date. Hello everyone. My name is Ella, and I want to thank you for joining me for episode 8 of my podcast on the accountability gap in domestic violence crimes. Now, I'm going to talk about a personal story today and show you, in my opinion, exactly what the lack of accountability in domestic violence crimes does not only to the victim, but to the victim's family members. And this is what is called the generational trauma. And it's real. It's very real, and it's devastating. So as I just relay my story to you, the listeners, I'd like you to sort of keep in mind that my main focus on talking about domestic violence crimes is the lack of accountability. In my opinion, it makes the victims suffer so much more. And when people think about domestic violence, they often think about what you see on the outside, the physical effects, the bruising and police reports and court procedures. All of that immediate response is what you would expect if you were a domestic violence victim. Quite often, as we know, we don't get the judicial responses that we deserve, but this episode is just going to be talking more about what the lack of accountability does when the bruises have gone and the court cases, if you're lucky to actually get your case into court. Once that's over, the physical injuries have healed. Time moves on, but the emotional and mental devastation inside the victim, unless it's dealt with professional knowledge and care and understanding, the victim never heals. And in fact, in my family, her pain, my mother's pain, only intensified as time went on. And when perpetrators are not held accountable, as I said, the consequences for that extend far beyond the victim. For me and my situation, they started the domestic violence, it was perpetrated against my mother when she was a young girl. It was sexual violence perpetrated against her by her twin brother, Lance McNeil. This happened in Australia many, many years ago. But as my example of the start of the domestic violence, the sexual violence in my family, it started with my mother, and I'll just briefly explain exactly what I mean by domestic violence, pain and trauma feeding through to generations to come. After my mother was sexually abused by her brother, she was about 12 or 13, I believe, there was no real accountability for that crime. There were no criminal consequences and no justice for her. I will note here that her mother did try somewhat, I suppose you could say, to hold the twin brother, I suppose you could say, accountable, but she did take my mother and her twin brother, the perpetrator, Lance, to the police station because it's on record that Lance McNeil had assaulted his twin sister, my mother. But as far as the consequences after that report, there was nothing. So I can only imagine the devastation and the pain and trauma and confusion and sadness that my mother was living through at that time when there was no therapy, there were no psychological evaluations or help or... I mean, I know it was a different time, but it still doesn't really excuse the fact that a young girl was seriously abused and adults in the medical fraternity didn't give her care and support. I mean, I know the support would be completely different to what we get these days, but there was nothing. The only thing that she got was she was full of anxiety, depression, fear, complete despair. So her mother took her to the doctor and the doctor put her on Valium at 13 years of age. And, you know, listening to this and saying these words, you know, it's shocking. We sort of think, you know, not in a million years would that happen today. Pardon the pun, but she was put on Valium at 13 years of age. And my grandmother went along with that The doctor said it was fine. She believed the doctor. But, putting a young girl on Valium, I mean, it just, it's just so incredibly devastating, because as the years passed, she became dependent, not only on Valium but other prescribed medications, and also on non-prescribed drugs. I mean, she was just a young, traumatised little girl who never received the help she desperately needed. In the meantime, her brother simply moved on with his life. He left the state and established his own art gallery in Victoria, Australia. And he married and had children and seemed to live a happy and successful life. And he lived up until the age of 90. No accountability. He paid no price for destroying my beautiful mother. But someone paid that price, and that was my mother. Eventually, so did I. Because when I was just 8 years old, my mother died from opioid poisoning. I lost not only my mother, but the opportunity to grow up with the most loving, gentle and beautiful soul. She truly was this gentle, sweet, beautiful young lady. And I'm still so angry deep in my soul. So angry that she never got to see her children grow up, and for her children to have their own children. I now understand that what I witnessed with my mother wasn't simply an addiction. It was unresolved and untreated trauma brought on by the most vile acts of sexual abuse against her by her own brother, Lance McNeil. And trauma rarely affects only one person. It ripples outward. I think if you speak to any victim of domestic violence, whether it be domestic violence in the form of physical abuse, psychological abuse, or sexual abuse, they would understand, I think, and agree with what I'm saying, because it's not just the victim that is devastated, hurt, destroyed. It does ripple outward. And then, as I grew up without my mother, I came to another really painful realisation, and that was that with my first marriage, my ex-husband, my children in that marriage, they witnessed me being domestically abused. And it wasn't because I didn't love them, and it wasn't because I didn't try to escape it was because the violent thug of a man who was my ex-husband, who I married when I was such a young girl, really, prevented me from leaving, enjoyed beating me up, enjoyed ridiculing and hurtful actions towards me. But trauma has a way of echoing through families, and until you don't really realise how much it's affected you and where did that come from and why did that happen to you. In my subsequent marriage, in my second marriage, I had a daughter, the most beautiful, beautiful daughter. She's grown now, but she helped me through so much trauma. And she was wise enough and caring enough and loving enough to me to see that the trauma that I had been suppressing from being abused in my first marriage was the ripple effect of what had happened to my mother. And she said to me one day, she said, "This is not going to continue through any more generations. This is going to stop now." What a loving, beautiful, caring thing to even think, but to work through it as well, to stop the trauma in its tracks and to prevent it from moving another day forward in the rest of my life and the rest of her life. It's not going any further. It's gone. It's in our past. And I just thank God my beautiful, beautiful baby girl helped me through that. And she always gives me the credit for being so strong and wise and loving, but she's the one that holds me up, and she's where my life is and we're each other's hearts. But this is just an example of what generational trauma does in families. You know, there's one crime, one offender, but countless victims across generations. The abuse in my family did not end with my mother. It reached me, and I will say here that it also deeply, deeply affected my other siblings. And they still are working through their intergenerational trauma as well. So, you know, it touched my children, it touched my siblings, it destroyed my father. But my youngest daughter has given me hope. She's given hope to future generations that no longer will they be hurt by the pain inflicted by Lance McNeil, the one criminal who hurt so many people that didn't deserve it. We didn't deserve any of it. We are beautiful, kind, caring people. So probably this sort of is a little bit of an insight into the understanding of why I am doing this podcast, why I speak about the lack of accountability all the time. I want to see things change now, because when we fail to hold perpetrators, to hold those criminals accountable, we don't just simply fail the victim. We inflict the pain onto the victim's most loved people in their future lives. And this has to stop. The true cost of domestic violence can never be measured only by police reports and court proceedings and hospital admissions or money. The real cost is measured in lost childhoods, broken families, untreated trauma, in lives shaped by events that should never have happened. So when we talk about domestic violence, we must stop asking ourselves what happened to the victim. We must start saying, who else is going to carry this trauma if nothing changes? Because domestic violence doesn't stop with one generation. And our commitment as a society to accountability shouldn't stop, should never stop. And on that note, I will say goodbye for today, and I will see you next week. So please look after yourself and stay safe. And remember, if you need any assistance and you're living with domestic violence, there are emergency service agencies ready and willing to help you. I will list all the ones in the UK at the end in my comments section. And if anyone wants to comment, that would be great. Please like, comment and subscribe to my podcast. That would be great too. So thank you, and I will talk to you next week.